Hello, thank you for tuning in to the Agora podcast. This is Daniel Pace, the producer of said podcast. I just wanted to let you know that we had an awesome conversation with Dr. David Manock on Friday, but unfortunately, there were several different technical difficulties, and so some of the video is weird. If you're listening to the podcast, that doesn't matter, but the more important part of that is the last probably 5 minutes of the conversation did not get saved. So it's going to cut off abruptly around an hour and 23 minutes or something. But don't let that throw you off. The rest of the conversation is really incredible, and I hope you guys enjoy the entire conversation.
Greetings and salutations. Welcome to the Agora. We are a forum to examine the unexamined life, or whatever the heck we decided to throw together on the drive-in. Sorry for the delay today. We had a few technical difficulties, so for our live audience eagerly awaiting our wisdom on pins and needles, we apologize, but we are good to go now with a snazzy new microphone, I might add. Excellent choice, Daniel, our wise and learned producer. The blue really livens up the table, actually creates a little more ambiance. So for those who have not joined us yet, we are, as I mentioned, we're a place to examine the unexamined life. We are the place, we like to say, that we talk about the things that you want to but are afraid to. We believe that the issues of faith, morality, ethics, and society are far too important and complicated to be solved through memes and tweets on Facebook. And we also believe that we live in a world where every day it's easier to disconnect from anybody who might disagree with you. And as a result, we've lost the ability to actually articulate our worldview and to consider the possibility that maybe our worldview is not entirely correct. So the greatest advancement in knowledge comes from the ability to realize that we don't know everything. To phrase some dead old Greek guy that we all know well.
Did wonderful things.
Lots of Greek guys did do.
I'm not biased because I'm Greek.
No, not at all. Not at all. By the way, you want to go out for gyros after this?
Okay, you're done, Garrett.
Go for a gyro. I once again am still Garrett. This once again is still my good partner in crime, Richard, and we are joined by a very special guest today. Richard, do you want to tee up our wonderful Dr. Manock?
Yeah. So this is Dr. David Manock, and he's a clinician here, right? Psychology clinician, psychotherapist here in Salem, Oregon. So
Psychotherapist.
And today we're going to be talking about a pretty broad topic, but I think we've got some really important information. We're going to be talking about trauma, the way it relates to our life, the way it also makes us think, which I think is part of the whole idea of Agora. How does trauma change the way we think? What does it do to our brain chemistry? And how do we deal with trauma? How does it affect us individually, societally? How do we know if we really have trauma, et cetera? So we probably have more to talk about than we're going to have time today, but I'm very excited to have David here. He's going to be a great addition to kind of jump us off from where we were last week, where we talked about when helping hurts. And so, David, why don't you tell us? I mean, I've got your.
By the way, a shout out to our guest last week, Dwayne Hilty from Salem Leadership Foundation.
That's right.
As of this time last week, we had no idea David Manock even existed, and Dwayne referenced him and mentioned just what a great asset and resource you've been in helping him as he and working with the community deals with people experiencing trauma. So thank you, Dwayne, so much, and we hope this is the beginning of the first of many times that we can work together. So
yeah. So it looks here, I mean, you have 8 pages. I'm not sure how much of this you want me to go through, but I can start with, you've got a Doctor of Philosophy, Marriage and Family Therapy, 2003 from Fuller Theological Seminary, Master of Science, Marriage and Family Therapy, a Master of Divinity, a Bachelor of Science in General Studies, looks like from a couple different places.
I would love to see the wall in your office, by the way.
Yeah. You're very well qualified here, more qualified than Garrett and I will ever be. We've got title of dissertation, your relationship between adult attachment styles and image of God and individuals. And so, number one, why don't you tell us a little bit about your past, kind of why you've gotten into clinical psychology and how that relates maybe to trauma, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, first of all, I'm Eurasian because I was born in Japan. My mom's Japanese, my father was Scandinavian. I have double reserve culture background, so I married an Italian.
Oh, okay.
It's a wonderful mistake.
Thanksgiving at your family must be an interesting.
It's probably loud, like my Greek family.
Yeah, opposites attract, but try living with an opposite.
Oh, boy.
Right.
I'm just trying to think like Scandinavian sushi mixed together, trying to like a new hybrid fusion.
But I was adopted by a wonderful Christian couple here in Salem, Oregon at 9, and all three of us in our family. My brother, my sister, who's Hispanic, and my parents were, mom was Scottish, blonde as blonde you could be, and my dad was red hair English. So we had a nice international family. Kind of United Nations, walking United Nations.
Right.
Except without the arguing. And
without the arguing and fighting and swearing and, well, maybe, I don't know, under the breath. Yes. And I think all those things were formative. But I had quite a bit of trauma in my first 9 years because I grew up in post-war World War II Japan, which was being reconstructed. So half the city was bombed out. You got heavy occupational troops, Americans, and they were in the hillside, caves dug out, and food lines. And so being Eurasian was just not a good thing. The Japanese were just devastated, humbled, and so nobody would walk with me to school. I was socially isolated. So yeah, kind of trauma, but with adoptive parents who were just wonderful folks. My trauma from 9 to 22 were held until I went into the Army.
Wow.
And then for me, it was like, okay, it's time to go to work. And it took me until about 55 to work through all the stuff. But in the process, learned about psychology and theology personally. So I have a dual background, one in theology and one in psychology. I started out in psychology, but the more I read psychology, I thought the answer isn't here, so I switched to philosophy. But then I realized philosophy is good to help me to think clearly, logic. But the answers weren't there, so I shifted to theology, because at least theology, they're proposing answers, whether you accept them or not.
Right.
So I have the dual background. So I'm trying to look at people from the side of the sacred text, how that informs me, but I'm also looking at the person psychologically. And so I read the text psychologically as well as theologically.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll dive into this obviously as we go on over the next hour and a half, but I feel like in relatively recent times, the acceptance and the integration of psychology and counseling and therapy with traditional theological understanding has been much more widely embraced by Christianity at large. I feel like for a period of time, there's a bit of hesitancy to say, okay, we don't want to be too associated with the quote-unquote secular sciences. Would you agree with that? Do you think there's been more widespread acceptance in the recent years?
I think so, and I hope that will increase, because we can put it this way: good and honest science should go with good and honest theology.
Amen.
But theology and science that's politically driven is just doesn't integrate. It's really bad. The Nazis practiced bad science. And bad theology too.
Yes.
So it does, and that's a sad graphic case of where people use science and use theology for political purposes. And I'm a researcher. I want to know what a thing is. Research is just slow, methodical, and dumb.
Right. And probably a bit boring, right?
And boring.
Yeah. Embrace the boring. If you want to do
Embrace the
research.
boring. But the people nowadays, especially young adults, want what I call sexy research insights. So when I taught over 700 graduate students, and they would have to write papers for me, and they're always finding sexy articles. And I go, well, that's interesting. But research is a whole different ballgame than extracting from the internet something, because you can pretty much find anything on the internet.
Right. And I think that's an important distinction, because one of the things that research is supposed to do is give you real knowledge. Right?
Yeah,
it's supposed to delineate between opinion versus this is actually what the evidence suggests and where it leads.
Yeah,
and putting all that
you
together.
guys know 3 months ago, COVID-19, right? Masks.
Yeah.
How many times has the government, so-called scientists, remember at the very beginning, we're going to do this by science. And I went, well, good luck.
Because science always agrees on everything in every way. You never take an observation and extrapolate a conclusion from it. No, that's so we have a segment called the cliche of the day, and that would have been a really good one to discuss today. The idea of, well, the science says this, and people say that settles the argument, but we all know that's not the case.
It's not the case, and if you do science well, it's very humbling. For me, it's very humbling, because I go, okay, I know a little bit. I don't know a whole lot.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's actually my experience of reading the sacred text.
There's also something to be said, I think, of that even things like psychology, maybe we'd say public health, is a bit of an evolving field, because what we know changes.
Absolutely.
And I mean, think about it. Bloodletting was a standard practice, right? But
What, you mean I can't leech myself?
No.
Headaches?
You know, but what becomes standard changes over time.
Yeah.
And so I think that the real key to science is, I think the problem is sometimes people look at science and say, well, now that's a fact.
Yeah.
Now I can move on.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, the book is always open in science.
Yes.
It's always open, and it's
Yes.
always open for reinvestigation and new evidence. And that's the key, is if you're not open in that, like you just said, I want to be humble.
Yes.
If you're not open to that idea that things can be reassessed, you know, and I do understand that, because there's certain things, like maybe in the hard sciences, where we've got some ideas that seem to be, you know, set in stone. But if you look at the revolution that happened post-Newtonian physics or classical physics, now we've got...
And now we're sliding into string theory.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
my goodness, that's a whole different ballgame.
Right.
Well, anytime you live in the physical world, you can't really prove anything. That's why I say the only thing you can really prove is mathematics, because 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of whether there's a physical universe in existence. But anytime you live in an actual world with material, an actual universe with material, our understanding and our perception of that material can change.
Real world is nasty, because it slams us into facing some objective reality. It's there. So, you know, for the hardcore postmodernists who insisted everything's just contextual, subjective, I said, okay, let me take a bat and I whack you. But remember, it's only subjective. Frame of reference.
It's not real pain.
There's no objective bat or me, the bad person hitting you.
I'm going to try that sometime.
It was very interesting. I remember listening to a professor talk one time. He was visiting a campus, and they had built a new music building. And the building, they said, was designed to reflect reality, and nothing makes sense. And so they had a staircase and doorways that would lead to nowhere.
Story,
And he asked them this question, which I thought was really interesting. Did they do that with the foundation?
Yes, great insight.
And so it was. So there's only so far you can sort of get with that. But let's get back on track. So viral exam, and then I think we'll actually let's finish with your dissertation. So explain to us the clinical research you've done over the years, and what was your dissertation on? Try to expand all that, and your practical experience with trauma.
Well, I was trying to understand how people are in relationship with each other, the horizontal dimension, if you want to think about it that way. How does that intersect with our vertical dimension, relationship to God, or relationship of transcendence? Transcendence for me is every human strangely is haunted by a sense you need something bigger than you to organize your particular experiences. Because second law of thermodynamic, I thought, tells me very clearly from the side of physics, we're not improving with time. Everything's digressing.
We're not a
with
fine
time.
wine.
And then there's some physicists who have a Hindu concept, and I love their leap of faith. Oh, it's going to evolve into another universe. Oh, sweet. The math isn't there if you do the hard math part. But yeah, everything's digressing. So I thought in narrative therapy, part of my background, we ask 5 essential questions because humans are designed neuro-emotionally to organize experiences through stories. Your brain is a story collection mechanism. We can put it that way in a simplistic terms. So you got 5 stories: stories of your birth, stories of your name, stories of your family, stories of your work, stories of your love, and then narrative therapists are real nervous about talking about the 6th story, the story of your faith. Because all first 5 stories sometime in life will collapse. And so I go, okay, story of your faith, story of something bigger than you. Is there a basket that these pieces are caught in and reorganized? Then I thought, that's what the sacred text seems to be telling us, whether we accept it or not.
Well, that's so poignant. We actually just had a retreat with our students who work on college last February, and our theme was this idea of the stories of God, and the focus was how there's more of Scripture written in narrative than any other genre. And that's not by coincidence. God realizes that we as humans, like you said, we learn through story. We're all seeking a meta-narrative to everything. We're seeking how we fit into a grander design. And I mean, there's discourse and there's poetry in there as well, but the largest percentage is in a story form. Rather than just giving raw data and information, it's how do we see ourselves identifying through the story of Abraham or David or Peter to the larger story that is being written. And whatever, you don't have to be a person of faith to recognize that. You can be, of any background.
Another way to say that, if you are not a person of faith, is that there is an overarching meta-narrative that you believe that is universally true for all humans.
Yes.
And so for the Christian, they would say we believe the story of God, or human nature is universally flawed, right, or true for all people. So whatever meta-narrative you put in place, it's going to frame or reference all your other stories. It's going to put it in context.
Right, and your brain is neurologically wired to
look at it that way.
Experiences through stories and color codes the stories with emotions. And we have from brain scan to the 1990s, this is called the decade of the brain because we began to scan the brain intensely. And some of us in research, I being one, after looking at brain scan implications, I realized we were in absolutely trouble psychologically in our society to boot, because before brain scan we taught people things like you need to love yourself, you need to know yourself, you need to forgive yourself because you are independent, you should be autonomous, don't be codependent, and focus on self-identity, self-worth, self-agency, and self-identity, and all that is myth. You're not organized. Your brain structure and architecture and dynamic is not organized around you. We used to think that the person's brain was some internal process, and there is internal process, complicated internal process, but this is the first movement. Then it goes out to people in relationship. We got it completely backwards.
So to put it maybe in a more palatable or easy to understand.
Terms.
Yeah. The idea was it was all about you. There was a you there versus the idea now from neuroscience and brain scans is that the you that you're talking about is interdependent upon how you interact with others.
We're wired for interdependence.
We're wired for interdependence.
And so it's not, before brain scan, we believed in one person's psychology. Oh, an individual. No, there's no such thing. It's two-person psychology. And going back to the research I did, I was trying, how do relationships impact how one experiences or defines or interact with transcendence or God or higher power, however. And the usual ideas from Sigmund Freud, we have guards. Your concept of God is a childhood projection, which means if your dad beat you up, you should have a nasty view of God. If your dad was kind and soft and compassionate, you should have a positive view of God, right? Negative dad, positive God. I mean, negative dad, negative God. And positive father, positive. I did 581 respondents. So I had a huge sample collection, and I found inverse correlation. No.
So bad father, they actually had a higher degree of believing in God versus good father, they had a lower degree of believing.
Opposite.
Well, great. That means my children are... No, I'm just kidding.
You need to be a worse father than your children.
I need to be worse. I need to...
Well, but you stop...
Taking them down a peg.
But stop and think about it for a moment.
True.
If God is a transcendent being, well, he's not shipwrecked in us in nature. The definition so we can project if your dad beats you up. You can project that as and we have a lot of people just hating churches, hating God, or hating religion, and that's sadly a painful, legitimate human experience. But if God is transcendent, why can't he be compensatory?
Right.
In spite of pain, why can't he organize? And so it takes two people to understand a person's subjective experience.
Right. It seems like to do a thought experiment anyway, we would know this is true. I think the idea of spending 5 years alone on an island sounds awful. You know,
didn't work well for Tom Hanks.
Well, Tom, I was about to reference that movie.
3.5 years.
He
why
created
did he create Mr. Wilson?
He could.
He needed it.
Right?
It's better than nothing to have volleyball the time.
We are not autonomous individuals. We're interconnected individuals. And part of how we define self is in that interconnection. So I wanna make sure we transition here into trauma. So those are really good understanding points as we move into understanding what trauma is. So I know you have a lot of clinical experience dealing with trauma, PTSD, divorce care, probably all sorts of stuff, the gamut. Let's say nobody knows anything about trauma. Sure. Lay out maybe where trauma, the idea of trauma started to come from, because I don't think trauma was talked about 100 years ago. I mean, it's a more recent thing. And maybe differentiate the difference between like trauma, its history and how we know it, and the different kinds. Like you talked about micro tear trauma and then major trauma, and sort of break that down for us step by step if you can.
All in 3 minutes.
Oh, in 3 minutes.
No, not 3 minutes.
Okay.
Take your time.
Okay. In psychology, there are three things we have to ask as foundational questions. So trauma, we have to ask, is trauma an actual phenomenon? Is there such thing as trauma?
Okay.
Or is it a construct based on someone's theory? Or is it a metric, some kind of measurement based on someone's theory that gives us a construct? So here's a case. You guys have heard of Myers-Briggs,
Yep.
right?
Oh, yeah.
Introvert, extrovert. Okay, Myers-Briggs is highly reliable. You give Myers-Briggs to 100 people, you get reliable pattern responses. And you go, okay, this thing is reliable. It's not valid. We don't know what it's measuring. We just know it measures it really well.
Okay.
But I quote you on
And
that.
so it's based on Carl Jung's personality theory of introvert, extrovert. We don't know if there is such things as introvertedness or extrovertedness.
So it presupposes that Jung had it right, but we don't know that Jung had it right.
And then it created a metric
Fascinating.
called Myers-Briggs. And here's the problem in our society: repeated use of something. You would know this is your background, rhetoric. Repeated use creates an impression it's a reality.
Right.
And that's where trauma, I can tell you, I can diagnose trauma. I have the VA sends me PTSD soldiers, both active and inactive, and it's a privilege to work with them, because for me personally, it's kind of like me trying to give back to society.
Yeah.
I actually think it's good to recognize who you are indebted to in life, and not that you have to pay back fully, but at least try to be responsive. So I thought, well, I'll work with PTSD soldiers because the VA doesn't pay very well.
Yeah.
And they make me go through reams of paperwork just to get paid.
Right.
I have about $30,000 worth of VA that hasn't paid yet.
Wow.
It'll take months on end.
Right.
So it's not worth it from a small business practice, but it's important.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, what is trauma? Well, the word trauma has been so used, and remember, St. Paul says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And that's characteristic of modern society and postmodern world. We are word focused, and repeated use seems to create or reveal that phenomenon. Since I'm a researcher, I go, no.
Right.
No.
So a way to maybe recap, and correct me if I misunderstand, but it seems, so what we're relating to is that trauma itself
Yes.
is difficult to understand because
Yes, the phenomenon trauma.
Right. One, you could create a theory, and then you could
Yes.
create a metric to
Right.
measure that, like
Yeah.
Myers-Briggs, but you're not sure what you're totally measuring. You're not sure if you're actually seeing it from the ground up. And so, but part of that is, you said, in our earlier discussions, you were talking about that trauma. Since we've switched to brain scans, what has that revealed about trauma? We have people who have bad experiences, and maybe this is the time to bring in our cliche of the day. But
I think so.
we hear it often heard. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger.
That's true.
Okay, well,
The trick is to
there's-
avoid being killed.
right.
So if I'm in a car crash and paralyzed from the neck down, am I stronger?
You can.
Well,
if
you
make
might
an
be in one
existential
way.
choice.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you
Your
might
body
be one
may
way.
be limited, but if you define
What do we mean by strong?
precisely,
Yeah.
and what do you mean by quality of life? Joni Erickson, I think, is an amazing lady.
Yeah.
I mean, and talk about courage. I mean, that lady has gone through more pain than most of us could even imagine.
Right. For those who don't know, you want to clarify who Joni Erickson is?
I think it was a young lady back in the 70s. I hope my history is correct.
60s, I think.
Was it
Yeah, I
60s?
think
A
it was about
swimming
65,
accident, and she was paralyzed neck down, and she made the best of it.
Yeah. She's amazing. I had the privilege of hearing her speak in person for the first time a couple years ago at Mission Connection. And not only is she paralyzed from the neck down, she'd gone through breast cancer. And just,
Yeah.
I remember thinking to myself, man, I'd like to think I would face a challenge like that with as much grace and dignity and faith as she did. But that is so overwhelming, and that gets to the danger of defining and saying, as we get into this is a whole tangent we could dive into, but the quality of life, well, somebody is better off dead than having to live like that. That's imposing our assumption upon them, and that's, and not to dive into this can of worms today, but many in the abortion rights advocacy channels will use that as an argument of, well, it's better to not allow a child to be born than to be born into such a traumatic situation, a family that's not able to love them and not welcoming and not able to take care of them. It's better that they just don't have any knowledge of that and are just snuffed out. And that's a classic example of presupposing the idea of worth, of joy, of value, onto something, and say they may have an incredible amount of joy that we might perceive as trauma, but not from their perspective. So,
yeah, the value of life is relationally defined. So I've watched fathers. I remember one meeting I went to, and it was an adult meeting, kind of a symposium, and for some reason he had apparently a Down's syndrome kind of a son. Yeah. And who sat next to him and participated. And I loved that, just watching the two of them. I could ask intellectually, did the boy understand anything? But there was quality, the nonverbal language between father and son was a really bonding. Talk about quality of life.
Absolutely.
Right. So, again, in the like clinical sense,
sure.
how are people diagnosed with trauma? Like someone comes in PTSD, and I kind of want to understand the difference between. And you made this point earlier, which I think is really valuable. Someone goes to a grocery store, they can't find an item they want. They have to go to maybe 2 other grocery stores, and it's like, oh, that's so frustrating.
Can't find toilet paper.
Is that trauma, or is that just frustration? Versus somebody who was beaten as a child and they have trauma. And so how do you as a clinician understand the difference between that? And if you want to unpack that a little bit.
I have a client who gives me that report, shares about his or her frustration of not finding a particular store item and so forth. Yeah, that could reflect what we call trauma, but it may just be welcome to life. Life sucks.
Right.
Life is hard. You go to a store, you don't always get what you want because life is hard. As a clinician, I say to myself, because I'm forced to work with people with what we call psychopathology, where there's psychologically things are dysfunctional, things are painful, and they're shipwrecked and all those things. If I say this person, if I have a negative view of that person, then it impairs my ability to become a healing process for them. If I say this person is actually incredible, I don't think I could do as well as he or she is doing, then that sense of compassion, their emotional system picks up the compassion, and then we have a chance to flow into healing. So what is trauma? Well, life, we can say generally speaking, life is hard. It's trauma. Some people seem to be more privileged in terms of life, in terms of cushions of life. Well, okay, but that's always been human history.
Yeah.
Right? Life is just hard. Well, how does that relate to trauma? Trauma is anything, generally speaking, I can take you to the DSM-5, which is a standard diagnostic manual psychiatrists, physicians, therapists, counselors use to diagnose trauma. But I can also take you to one of the DSM-5 means we're in the 5th edition. And it's already out of date. I can take you to one of the co-authors of the DSM-5, and he says very clearly, this is out of date, okay? So when you get diagnosed by a clinical psychologist, MFT, LPC, and psychiatrists, even a top gun neuropsychiatrist in mental health field. The neuropsychiatrist is top gun. Okay, so
so what things are they looking for when because there seems to be a lot of people, it seems like trauma is what happens to you.
Yeah.
Or is trauma something we participate? I mean, like, so
Well,
what's the difference
is it an
between
event,
major
or is it a
is it a major
mindset?
trauma, micro trauma? How do we differentiate between those?
we are designed, our brain scan research shows that we have a social brain, and we are relational creatures. We're interdependent, and in a world full of danger, challenges, threats, and sadly evil. There's no way not to experience trauma. For me, trauma phenomenologically is just a matter of degrees.
So could I give an illustration, and maybe you can
Please,
say,
yeah.
I've always thought of trauma this way. If, let's say I was a hunter-gatherer and I was out there and there was a giant creature that attacked me and it almost killed me, that would lodge trauma deep enough into my psyche that I would never forget it. Maybe a child touching something really hot, traumatic moment of saying, like, don't ever try to touch that, or that thing could hurt you. Is trauma rooted sort of in that system, just by nature of being in the world? There are things that are going to hurt us, and the fact that we remember those things is where.
Right. And
I have a follow-up question when you're done.
yeah,
on that.
and you're getting at it. So we want to think, in neuroscience, we think in terms of three domains. The brain, there's your biology. You can scan and weigh the brain, about 3.8 pounds average human brain, and you can dissect. Okay, brain, nobody argues about the brain. The mind, and currently you have 150 different definitions of the mind in research, which is a nice way to say we don't know. We can scan you looking at a tree and show you the optical stimulus response patterns and circuitry in your brain through brain scan. But the moment I ask you, what do you see? And you say, I see a tree. Can't scan it. I
Right.
go,
You can't
but we
see that.
know
Yeah.
everyone is conscious. Mind is conscious.
Yeah.
Then the other domain is relationship. The brain is not about you. It's about relationship. And the relationship can actually impact. Okay, how does this all connect with our discussion about trauma? Well, we live in a dangerous world. But and our system's designed to operate in a dangerous world. We have a secondary system, which very few people talk about, the parasympathetic and sympathetic system, massive nerve endings around the gut, the heart, the lungs, that goes to the right side of the brain, okay? So your system's monitoring, and it goes into fight, flight, or freeze. And so whatever trauma is, it is a threatening, dangerous experience, and we can say traumatized. That creates a neural circuitry. But let's be honest, that's a good thing for survival.
Well,
Right.
that's what I was
Right.
going to kind of follow up on my question. For me, my lay understanding, maybe you can expand on this, the idea of trauma is when it crosses over from just good information for survival into irrational fear. So a child touching a hot stove, if he says, oh, I shouldn't touch a hot stove because it's hot, that's good. I learned that when I do this, it caused me physical damage. But then a child being afraid to ever
Let them touch the stove.
Well, yeah, exactly. But then if a child, if they grow up, they're afraid to ever even cook on a stove, to ever be near a stove. So it seems to me that an element is when it crosses over from rational understanding of
Right.
this is good for my
Yeah.
survival
There you
to
go.
completely irrational fear that inhibits your ability to survive. So how is that leap made from somebody just touching and saying, oh, it's a hot stove, I shouldn't touch that, to somebody being afraid to ever be near a stove again, or whatever it might be?
Right, because we know certain kinds of leprosy, the people actually put their hands on a fire and they don't have any sensation.
Yeah.
And so they burn themselves.
Pain is a good thing. It helps
is
us
a
to
good
know.
thing,
Yeah.
but pain can be traumatizing. and that can lead to traumatic behavior, like avoiding going into the kitchen because you got burned by the stove.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, good luck going through life avoiding kitchen, period.
And this is I mean, literally we're diving into kind of the main part of this. So, you know, traumas sometimes is something we don't fully understand, right? I mean, sometimes we haven't unpacked it enough to where we realize where the trauma's coming from. But we get an automated response when trauma's triggered, right? The word triggered.
Yes.
So
The buzzword these days.
It is a buzzword,
but it's a real thing.
It is a
even
real
if it's
thing.
been-
It's just overused, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
But that triggers you.
Daniel's
Okay,
triggered
Daniel's
right
triggered.
now, so go to your safe space.
But the interesting thing is like, so let's unpack this just a little bit and then maybe get some clarification on how trauma changes the way we think.
Yep.
Because to me, this is one of the biggest things. So, for example, my kids are afraid of certain things, okay? It's traumatic to them to face those certain things. But sometimes, like, I'll give an example. We were at, many, many years ago, Legoland. My daughter was terrified of the roller coasters, cried her eyes out, throwing tantrums, telling me, don't, you know, basically probably everyone looking around is being like, that's an awful, horrible dad. And I was trying to convince her, go on the roller coaster. It's not that scary. It's a calculated risk. And this is the part that to me that is most fascinating about, if we talk about trauma, is that trauma sometimes shuts down our ability to think. And I'll let you jump in on this. But she eventually overcame her fear and went on it and had a great time and smiled and laughed and was like, and I keep referencing that when she faces things that are hard for her. I say, remember what was on the other side of that. So, but it was probably traumatic. It's something she remembers. It sticks out into her mind.
The moment was traumatic.
Right.
Right.
And so I wonder if some sense of, you know, growing in trauma or learning how to think through trauma is understanding the maybe the depth or the sincerity of trauma. Like if you get burned by a stove, you wouldn't all of a sudden be like, I'm never going to go around a stove again.
Not consciously in your mind. You're not.
You would be cautious.
You would be
initially,
cautious.
right? But you could overcome that, and you could overcome the cautiousness through relationships.
Right.
Through somebody saying, hey, look,
So
I'm
if I was
going to
research your episode with your daughter, you report it, it'd be nice to have a videotape of you talking with with her, interacting. Then I would turn off the sound to do a 7 layers nonverbal language to show you what you're doing. You're holding her trauma, and she's experiencing the trauma and fear of being held. It's the relationship that is helping her to hold the trauma, to move forward, to get on the ride, and then have a positive experience. So that, for me, since I'm trained theologically, I thought, well, that's what the ancient Hebrew text says. Though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. So what or who's holding the fear of dying, which can be traumatizing?
Right.
It's
I
the
experienced that
relationship.
firsthand. Yeah.
The first, and so if we also know that if a police person gets, if their partner gets shot in front of their eyes, and let's say answering domestic violence situation, they're going to show trauma, PTSD, post-traumatic. They're going to have all the signs, and sadly, those PTSD police people who've been traumatized will oftentimes end up in divorce. And trauma at the deepest level is some experience of threat and danger, which our system is hyper monitoring for survival and for growth purposes. But it can shipwreck your assurance of relationship. That's the greatest damage.
So trauma shipwrecks your assurance of relationship.
Yes.
So just to keep driving this home and maybe just speak to this, how does trauma shut down our ability to think? Like, what does the research show? How does it change the way we think?
there are complex brain chemistry responses that happens in trauma, and it can inhibit your ability to think clearly. Every student, college student, knows this. It's called exam stress.
Yeah.
You want to have enough exam stress to make you stay up all night and study.
Right.
It's that right balance of the two.
Right.
Finals week, here we go.
So a little bit of stress can be a good thing because it motivates us to do something that actually needs to be done, studying for our finals.
Though there are sometimes you're overwhelmed and your exam performance really goes down. And then as a clinician, if I have that kind of a client reporting to me that kind of experience, the place I look for is the first 5 years of their life. Because your mom wired you in to process relational things. And so no one's emotion gets out of kindergarten because at age 5, your brain reboots in three phases of infant amnesia. We don't know what it is. The only way I can describe it is like your mom is the one who built your house and wired the house in for electricity. But the moment they throw up the sheetrock, you can't see the circuits. But you certainly know they're there. How? Light, heat, sound, right? Those are emotions. And so if I'm working with a PTSD soldier, I always ask, could you bring in your spouse or your partner?
Yeah.
Because I have to reframe the PTSD from your PTSD to our PTSD. And two people holding PTSD together can break that a lot faster than a single person, because that's how we're wired for relationship, two-person psychology.
Right, well, our whole view of ourselves, even,
and
as we said earlier.
That's what you did with your daughter.
Yeah.
Right.
And that it brings me to an interesting observation. You keep hammering this idea of relationship and community, obviously, and these can be buzzwords, but as far as how we process trauma, that we don't really understand ourselves, except we understand ourselves in relation to others. And just tying that into kind of the current climate that we're in the COVID world, which we've been living in since March, essentially, one of the things I've observed is that one of the hardest things for people in the midst of this is that we are all literally in the same boat. I mean, not in the same boat. We're in the same storm, maybe not the same boat. It's affecting people differently, but it's harder to find sympathy from somebody when you're struggling, because they're like, well, yeah, everybody's struggling. The world literally is struggling. Versus if you're the one experiencing a trial, experiencing some degree of trauma, but your neighbor is doing great, they can help prop you up and help to absorb some of that. Here, it's kind of like, well, good luck finding sympathy. Yeah, you lost your job. I lost my job. Yeah, you're stressed. You had to be home with kids. I'm stressed. I had to be home with kids. Everybody's stressed. So I think that has made it harder for many people to process, because they don't have somebody who is maybe not in that season of darkness right now that they are. So, I mean, I guess how important is it in processing trauma to find those who are not in that darkness, who are in a stable position to help walk you through that?
And that's a good question. And I think the usual sense is, if I'm in pain, I need to find someone who's not in pain to help hold my pain. And that's valid.
Yeah.
But if you are a concentration camp inmate, and you don't have an option of a non-concentration camp inmate, can relationships still have an impact? The answer is yes, in spite. The interesting thing for me clinically about COVID-19 is, oh my goodness, we all have somewhat of a common experience, though we don't have a common resources to handle it. But it's like everybody is shut down to some degree, right?
So we have a sense of I can relate to what you're going through. I'm going through the same
because
stuff.
If anybody in our society currently says COVID-19, we go, what are you talking about? It's not the response you get, okay? And there is some sense of comfort in knowing we seem to be in the same boat.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but it's how you interact interpersonally in the boat that makes the difference. And trauma, for me, at the most organic level, is because we are in a dangerous world, and our system is monitoring and trying to respond with trauma, and that's a good system. The problem in our society, which believes in independence, is that when someone's traumatized, we think it's something about that person that they need to do some work or whatever, rather than seeing that the worst thing about trauma, beyond the symptoms, beyond the cognitive challenges, because it can affect the way you process and think and the behavior. A lot of traumatized people will do addiction. Because, frankly, addiction is kind of good. It has its own problems, but it's good in that you got to kill the pain.
Yeah.
Right.
So drink away, bro. It will kill the pain. The problem is it becomes the second pain.
Well, and that's a classic case of treating the symptoms but not treating the root cause. And from a theological perspective, as Christ followers, we can recognize the beauty of the gospel is that Christ comes to deal with the symptoms of the disease. I mean, he heals the lame, he gives sight to the blind, he gives hope to those who are downtrodden. But if that's where we stop, we're missing the point. I always use the illustration, Lazarus was raised from the dead. Amazing miracle.
Yeah,
what happened to Lazarus eventually?
Yeah, he died, right?
Yeah, I mean, he could have eaten a ton of vegetables and worked out every day and maybe gotten another 40 years. But if we stop there at just treating the symptoms, not that we shouldn't, because this is a little bit of a hot button issue within many Christian circles today, is social justice has become kind of this buzzword, and it's like you can either be one or the other. You can either be somebody who cares about the gospel of salvation or the gospel of serving and help and creating justice. And it's like, where are those mutually exclusive? I know we're getting off on a tangent here, but
remember, Jesus on the cross is a traumatic event, and if, as a person trained in psychology, when I read the pre-cross moment, the Garden of Gethsemane, he's in PTSD trauma.
Right.
Yeah, and notice what he's doing.
sweating blood.
He-
What else would he bleed, Richard?
He goes to a private garden. We think some wealthy guy, they have some connections. Then he tells the 11 disciples, wait here while I go beyond. Then he takes the 3 from his inner circle.
Yeah.
Right? And then he's constantly going back and forth. Can't you stay up and watch? And so forth. And Luke tells you that his forehead bursts with blood, which is just trauma. He should have died in that garden. And then Luke tells you the angel came. So when I read the sacred text, I'm looking at it psychologically. I'm saying, what's the human experience here? And psychology is a good enough science of relationship. And trauma is, we can say, life is traumatic, yet there are some people who really are traumatized by life, and we know the symptoms of that, and there are 3 huge signs of trauma beyond the technical diagnostic signs. That is, traumatized people tend to be emotionally flooded. Flooded. So when they have a flashback, we say they're into chaotic emotions. They can't get out of it. Okay. And then they to control that chaotic emotions of fear, anger, multiple chaotic emotions, they go into rigid behavior. So you got chaos. You got rigidity, and they often will break relationships.
And isolate
or destroy relationship.
Yeah.
Okay, and so, and also we know that if you have 100 soldiers, you send them out into battle, some of them are going to come back with PTSD. Sorry, it's just, but we also know from psychology we can predict which ones may be more susceptible to PTSD
Based upon
their early first years of life, and whether they're parents co-regulated their painful emotions. It goes like this. So just a thought experiment. What would be the impact if a little 5-year-old Susie comes to mom in the kitchen and says, Mommy, 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 there's a ghost in my bedroom. And if the mom says, Sally, stop it. We don't believe in ghosts. There's no such things. Don't be irrational. Get back in there. You're starving for time. I put you to bed. You come out once more, you're going to get spanked.
Yeah.
Is the fear of the ghosts going to increase or decrease? Okay? Versus a mom, the little girl comes in and says, Mom, there's a ghost in the bedroom. And mom drops down, gets to eye level. That's face to face. She's activating neural circuits in just that physical movement. And says, Sally, and says, give me your hands. There's a ghost? Curiosity says, let's walk back. And then they go into a bedroom, and mom says, where? She says, under the bed. So mom reaches down, gets down, pulls up the dust cover, looks, and says, I don't see, come on. Take a look. And Sally goes, it was there. Then mom takes the little girl, puts her on the lap, rocks her, and says, when I was about 5, I was afraid of ghosts. And Sally smiles. What happened to the trauma? It's co-regulated. No human has a DNA for self-regulation. That's a myth.
Wow.
So basically...
Your ability to experience painful things, including trauma, and not be overwhelmed by it, is connected to what we call co-regulation.
Well, that reminds me of something. I've been going through this with our own our 6-year-old here recently, where he started asking one day. He says, "Daddy, am I seeing things?" And he will ask us like 2 or 3 times a day. And we talked to our pediatrician about it, and she kind of walked us through how to kind of walk with him through that. So again, instead of saying, or he'll say sometimes seeing, sometimes he'll say hearing. Daddy, tell me I'm not hearing things. And he doesn't do it in a traumatic or scared way. He just like, Daddy, am I seeing things? Like, what are you talking about? So what we were told is to, instead of just saying, no, you're not seeing things, you're fine, actually go to him and say, son, hold my hand. Is this real?
Yes.
And how that grounds them and say, okay, touch the floor, feel things that are real, know that this is real. So
got to make that contact.
Okay.
Because that's sending massive signals. So
the physical contact.
Physical contact. So I use, and so that's from neuroscience understanding. So
it rewires your brain.
It rewires your brain and co-regulates. So if I go to bed with a lot of deadlines, but I get sleepy, I fall asleep, I'm going to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I have a choice. Do I go to work now and be exhausted all day, or do I try to get back to sleep? All I do is reach over, put my hand on my wife's bare back, skin-to-skin contact, because I know it's going to send massive neural signals through my system at 280 miles an hour through the bottom part of the brainstem, up to the top part, the neocortex, and I fall right back to sleep.
That's my wife is the exact same way. Sometimes, she'll need to go to bed early, and I'll be up for a little bit working on stuff, and she'll text me and say, "Can you just come lay next to me?" And she'll be out in 5 minutes. And I never stopped to think about the actual psychology behind that. I just thought she was lonely, but there's actual physiology behind
physiology and the physiology. Since I'm trained in that in a good enough way, when I look at the sacred text, you could give me any passage in the Bible and ask me, "Can you exegete this?" Because I was trained in theology, how to interpret the sacred text. I hear a lot of bad interpretation. I go back to the drawing board. But then I can tell you, given that verse, beyond the exegeting it, trying to understand what the text is saying, I can tell you some neuroscience part of that text. Like Jesus. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I'll come in and sup with him, he with me. Notice, he doesn't say, if anyone hears me knocking, you hear the knocking? Am I knocking loud enough? He says, do you hear through the knocking my voice? That's the right brain, voice recognition, relational recognition, and that brings openness. Trauma constrains, and then just you're flooded with emotions and you gotta do something. And we know that traumatized people have a high correlation from their childhood whose mothers didn't co-regulate them or actually traumatized them. So if I send 100 soldiers out in a battle, yeah, you can kind of predict how many may come back with trauma. And the ones who get stuck in the persistent trauma symptoms, you can find out their mothers didn't co-regulate.
Wow.
You set up for life in the first 5 years. But the good news is every relationship can rewire you.
Right. So let me pause right there and let's do a little bit of recapping. So some of the things that we've talked about are, one, we've talked about that the idea that you're just an individual.
Yeah.
You
That's
are
one person's psychology.
right. But the reality is that brain scans have shown us that we're
2%.
interdependent.
Yes.
So how we understand ourselves
Yeah.
is interdependent on others. Trauma can be both little events that happen over enough times. You get told.
Like in LA, we would have earthquakes, and it would take me about a month to get over the nervousness of driving.
Mm-hmm.
But within a month, I'm okay.
Okay.
The first month, I'm going.
Yeah.
So it can be little events that happen enough over time, or it can be big physical or emotional events, etc. And the problem with trauma, and I think the responsibility that we have as individuals is to understand our trauma, is that when we are in trauma, or when we allow trauma to control us, we're flooded with emotion. So would it be fair to say that's like fight or flight?
It is both fight and flight.
Or freeze.
And freeze, because your parasympathetic, sympathetic system is stuck open.
Right. And so when you're in that position, what I was trained to understand is that in trauma, hypothalamus, it's the one that basically tells you you're in fight or flight, and it actually shuts down your frontal lobe capacity.
Yeah,
the amygdala.
Yeah.
Thank you, the amygdala.
Yeah.
And so it shuts down your ability to think rationally. So you go into trauma, you get triggered.
Yeah.
And this is how it affects us like daily. We then get flooded with emotion, which is not rational thought. It's outbursts probably, and then it forces you into a rigid pattern of behavior, probably one that breaks relationships over and over and over again.
But we want to understand emotions are really essential.
Right.
Because emotions are the language of the human heart in
Versus the brain.
relationship.
Yeah.
The heart doesn't have any logic. Your brain has to gather in massive amounts of data, information, and try to make sense of it. And it does that. It makes sense by creating, even in the womb, little models. Me, the other person. It's called internal working model. Me, the other person, and that gets consolidated, and then it organizes experiences in other ways as well, and then what I call color codes it. And then that's why you get these moods and emotions that bubble up. But in our society, since we value independence, we don't teach people. And the Greek metaphysics screwed us over, because the Greeks.
Hey now.
Well, it's
Well, you did give us democracy, so we'll give you one.
Just do a little thought experiment, okay? If we could go back in time, the time of Jesus, let's say, and ask a Greek person, does a human have a mind, spirit, soul, and body? They would go, yes, of course. Humans have mind, spirit, soul, and body. If we ask the same question to a Hebrew person, does a human have a mind, spirit, soul, and body? They would look at a stranger and say, What are you talking about? A human doesn't have a mind, doesn't have a spirit, soul, body. Human is a mind. They did not split it. Greeks split. Plato and Aristotle and others consolidated a split and would never recovered. And early theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, others,
embraced it.
They embraced it.
Right.
They intentionally embraced Greek metaphysics, and we've been screwed over since. It's split is nice for systematic theology, but it's horrible for understanding relationship because we're not this. And same thing with trauma. Trauma is organic. It's us trying to process danger and threat. It can become problematic when it gets into a traumatized pattern of trauma behavior and cognition. But the key is shared trauma breaks the power of trauma faster than anything else.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to get into. I just want to finish recapping. And so you get into this thing where you're flooded with emotion, you're rigid, and you're rigid in your behavior. So you have a predetermined response mechanism that you're going to do over and over, and you probably end up hurting people through that process. Now,
and you hurt people because you need to experience an external relationship. You in pain? I brought you pain. You in pain? Yeah. Now you get me.
And so deep down inside there, really, what's at stake is we want empathy.
Yes.
Like really what we're looking for when the classic idea hurt people is that what we're trying to do is get someone to understand us or what we're feeling, what we're experiencing.
We have people out there protesting, doing all kinds of things. I think those people are saying there's pain. Yeah. Do you get it? If you don't, here's some pain.
Well, yeah, it's
okay. That's an interesting.
Well, it's.
I'm not saying that's right or wrong.
Right. You're just saying that's what's happening.
Right.
No, like this is the only way. I have this hurt, and rather than telling you about it, I'm actually going to make you experience my literal hurt in order to have empathy for me, and that's where. There will always be people in the world, as long as there's pain and hurt, there will be people who will say the only way to deal with it is make somebody else experience the exact same pain and hurt. It's not good enough to describe it to them. But that's not an effective solution because it just creates a cycle of more pain and more hurt.
Yeah, it just amplifies pain.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I don't think we're going to I don't know how you really solve racism. I think we should legislate racist behavior with good laws. Just laws. I don't know how you legislate racist thinking.
Because you're legislating thought at that point. Or
how can you police people's thoughts? I mean, cognition is really complex things, and you certainly can't legislate racist motivation. Behavior, cognition, what's behind all that is motivation. Yeah. And I'm psychoanalytically trained, which means I'm trying to do scuba diving down to motivation.
And that's the thing you can almost never see, right?
And that's real tricky. And I have my colleagues who are cognitive behavioral therapists rolling their eyes at me. But I also know from research what's motivating a person is driving the cognition and the behavior.
So that reminds me
go ahead.
of a wonderful message that Richard actually linked to me by a man named Vadi Bachman, who I was familiar with. I hadn't seen this particular message. For those who don't know, Vadi is he's a black pastor from Texas. Ministered in the he's a Reformed Baptist church for many years. Now he's a director of ministry at the African School of Theology in Malawi, I believe. I may be wrong on that. Correct me. It's a seminary in Africa. Anyway, wonderful, wonderful man of God. And he gave a presentation call on what he called ethnic Gnosticism. And he says it's a term he invented because what Gnosticism essentially, one of the foundations of it is this idea of this secret intuitive knowledge that you just inherently know it. You can't necessarily observe or look at it or try to observe it through empirical observation. You just inherently get it. And he talks about, in terms of race, there is this idea that as a person of color, I just immediately and instinctively know that what you said was racist. I know what your intention was even more than you know it, and there's no way you can know it. And likewise, as a non-person of color, he'd say, you can't possibly know what you don't know. You can't possibly know that what you were saying was racist, but it was because I know it. So it's a cycle of I know your intentions with 100% certainty. And to your point, I think in any aspect of life, that's a very dangerous precedent to set, to say I can tell you exactly what you were thinking, even if you don't know what you were thinking.
In clinical terms, I'm only about 70% correct when I try to discern someone's motive. 30% of the times, I have to apologize to my clients. I have to say, you know what? My response there missed it. Thank you. Tell me how much I missed it. And they do fine.
Imagine that, admitting that you were wrong, admitting that, being open to the fact that you didn't get it 100% right. What a novel
But I still
concept.
get to charge for the session. So it's win-win.
That's one way to look
Sorry.
at it.
So I want to transition into talking about trauma and what we can do about it. So I think it seems, it's been a recurring theme in everything you've said that if you isolate, trauma gets worse.
It gets worse.
If you give in to lashing out all the time, trauma gets worse. And I kind of want to, I got two questions, and I want to try to pack them in here at the end. And I don't know if we'll have.
Okay, so we got 20 minutes
So we got
left.
20 minutes.
Perfect.
So let's try to do 10 and 10, and then I think one is how does social media impact trauma? And what I mean by this is there's a lot of people, I think, trying to solve the world's problems by posting things, by literally, in some ways, like what you said earlier, I want you to experience my pain. So I'm going to post something that makes you experience my pain for the hope. Either way, but the point is that there's an action going on there. What is trauma going to do? Do those things make it better? Does social media make trauma better or worse from your perspective?
There's no good news I know of that comes from being on social media.
So no studies that show that it makes it better.
Your depression will increase if you stay on social media. And
this is my shocked face right here.
Well,
depression and anxiety have been on the rise.
Yeah.
Depression and anxiety have been on the rise
It's
since.
not necessarily causation, but
Right.
it's definitely correlated.
now, I wouldn't want to live in a day before social media because I love computers. I love the internet. Gaining information is absolutely essential. I wouldn't want to live in a day before the computer, right? Or my iPhone. Fair enough. But iPhone usage doesn't translate to mental health.
Yeah.
Only way you can improve your mental health and spiritual health too is just engaging
In relationship, face to face. And you talked about the idea that there's X, Y, and then the factor, like you used a great illustration to me earlier, which was super clear, which you moved towards me, and you said that's the Z plane, and we're made... We're made to have and you said as soon as I moved towards you, your body automatically responded, which is true. When you moved towards me, I was like, like that kind of analysis is it's gone on the screen.
Right. Your system is monitoring the other person.
Yeah.
So physical nature, demeanor, all that type of stuff, and that's missing.
And I also know people on Facebook, I was one of those dumb baby boomers. Facebook, somebody said I should do Facebook and say, okay. So I answered yes to everybody. And so I had 1,500 people who were my friends. I go, well, what's that?
Your acquaintances.
Because I go once a year to say happy birthday or something. That's
right.
Yeah.
I can't keep up. I literally can't. I just stopped. I'm like, I'm sorry.
But I also know the postings, and I know those people's lives really well. I can tell you that's what they're posting is a projection of pain.
Yep. So
and with the hope of some affirmation
Yeah.
and like his and go, and it's kind of sweet, but it's worthless for mental health purposes.
well, along
It's
those
also
lines,
like an addiction because
Well,
you get
oh, yeah.
dopamine releases when you get likes and integration, but you're removing an entire dimension of
Yeah,
interpersonality.
Yeah.
And it's dopamine, it's reward with no interaction with the person. So you're
Yeah,
it's just
and,
a bad-
It's a drug,
And no
essentially,
context, since
yeah.
we did just to step.
iPhone will activate certain dopamine circuitries. It's nice, but that doesn't translate into mental health.
Right. It could
If
also
you want
increase.
dopamine, you should do porn. That will boost.
much
Right.
better. Yeah.
Then
But
rather
porn
than
will destroy, because if a young person starts out with porn, if they stay in porn through adulthood and through marriage and so forth, their ability to perform sexually will go
Oh
down.
yeah.
Porn destroys you. Only way I can describe porn is it's a sugar high. You can get an immediate boost of energy, then it drops and it ruins your health.
Yeah, we could do hours on the dangers of pornography. And
I mean,
what
it's
I'm
almost like a
discovering
micro trauma.
It is. Well, even the again the quote unquote secular world and people not of faith are starting to finally acknowledge the dangers of porn, which is good. I think there's actually a lot of progress on that front across all spectrums. Well, maybe that's my limited observation.
I don't know about that. I think
But-
there's a huge contradiction out there
Yeah.
about all that. But
We could dive into that, but I was just curious. I had a quick question for you on those lines. So, have you done any sort? Because we've used the phrase here that it's easy to hate somebody through a screen or through an idea or meme they post. It's a lot harder to hate somebody when you see them face to face and you realize their humanity. So, have you done any sort of brain scan studies on the actual physiological effects? Like, say I post something on a page and I send it to somebody and say, let's just take a contemporary one. All police officers are bad and should be done away with. And they just read me post that. Versus say that to you in person, hey, I think all police officers are bad and should be done away with. Is there an actual physiological difference in the way our brains perceive that when it's presented on a screen versus when somebody says it in our presence?
I haven't done that research myself, but there has been research. And you can, people in relationship, live face-to-face relationship, there's a qualitative difference in their experience of the relationship versus just a flat screen. Even a picture of the other person can have some benefit, but exactly, in order for us to bond, we need three things. We need presence, and we need attunement, and we need resonance. Okay, so it goes like this. When I go home, and my wife is usually in the kitchen with her back away from me because I come in through the garage, the utility room. And I'll say, "Hey, Brand, how are you?" If she turns around and she goes, "David," and walks over and hugs me, and she's been doing that. About 3 years ago, she started doing that. Then she whispers, "Thank you, David, for working so hard for us." I love it. Makes my exhaustion immediately boosts 280 miles an hour. Of course, then she being Italian, she'll keep hugging me and stroking me, and I'm going 1001, 1002, because I'm Japanese, right? Can you get your hands off of me? I have those neural circuits from early childhood kicking in, right? Okay, but what if I come home and I say, "Hey, Brent, how was your day?" And she goes, 8 hours, you're gone. Not a single text. I don't exist, do I, David? What happens?
Totally different.
Yes.
The night is hard to recover.
Yes,
from there.
and what is the difference? What
Presence.
She's present. She turns around, present, and she walks towards me. She's starting to attune to me. But the resonance, actual energy transference, and you can't get actual energy transference on the internet. You're masturbating.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You're
that's one-
masturbating to-
mental
Come on.
masturbation.
To
The difference
Twitter,
between
to
masturbation and sexual intimacy
Yeah.
is huge.
right.
Well, somebody can say sarcastic is same results, particularly for a male. Okay, well, all right. But what is the difference?
Yeah.
There's
The
big
dimensions in which you're
difference.
operating.
Yeah, and its resonance.
Well, one strengthens your relationship with your
One
wife.
strength
The
is
one
a
would
bond, and
dis-
that's what
the
internet
bond.
doesn't allow.
So in some sense, I mean, I feel like maybe I'm jumping to conclusions
We
here,
got 2
but,
minutes left, so jump
but
away.
well, it's not that. It's in some sense.
Yeah.
Like a lot of what I've seen on social media, I see people post things and say things on social media that I've never seen them do in person.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they wouldn't do
Now
for
people
neighbors,
sometimes say this is like virtue signaling or all these other things, but in my mind, like reframing that, it's almost as if they're not in tune relationally with real
They're
people,
not.
and so the standards by which we judge people, like in the economy of the internet, is vastly different than the way we would judge people face to face. And I wonder if that is, well, I shouldn't say I wonder, I believe it's leading to dehumanization of people.
It is.
Vast swaths of people,
It is.
just
And
based on
that's
whether or
gonna-
not they
and that's gonna
subscribe to your
increase
thought.
Racism.
Well, it's gonna increase everything:
all kinds of
hatred,
isms.
All kinds of tribalism.
Disgust,
They're
Okay,
tribalism.
so
I
in a
don't need to
sarcastic
respect them.
moment, I thought the nice thing about being a researcher is you can have sarcastic moments based upon, well, my good enough understanding research. I thought there's no way to beat racism unless we could mandate that 51% of all marriages have to be interracial marriages. If you have enough interracial marriages, I think you can crack racism. I doubt that our society can otherwise.
Well, and that just
Because the interracial, you're forced to face to face.
yeah,
right?
but I think that even that misses the point of it's not just it's not just racism. Again, it's tribalism. It's the other. So you can
Tribalism.
have somebody. I have friends of the opposite race that I agree with, I identify with much more. I share much more of a common narrative in many ways. I have friends that have a skin tone that looks just like mine that couldn't be further apart from and would much less rather be around. So I just think that that gets, and I love how people talk about diversity, and I feel like essentially diversity means a default for people of different skin colors, and that's one aspect of it, but diversity is so much more than just that. But it's the old joke that, you look at a college, year guidebook or, an advertisement, they'll always make sure to have the students of color up front, whether that's the only ones they have on campus. So say, we're diverse. We have these students of color. Well, are you really diverse in the way that you think and interact? So I just, but back to your point, Richard, that the more we can just reduce somebody down to another tribe, it's easier to dehumanize them and to say they're not entitled to these rights.
And the face-to-face has the best chance of breaking that.
Right. The face-to-face is the key. The whole, there's a backstory behind the other. There's a bunch of research that's done on how did regimes kill tons of people. One of the things they did is created another. And another is somebody who's human but less than human.
Yeah,
and so and they're bad. You can do bad things to them.
Yeah, 280 million or 250 or 280 million people were killed in the 20th century by their government.
Right. Yeah.
You shouldn't fear racism. You should fear your government.
Couldn't say it better myself.
Let's develop.
Literally couldn't say it better myself.
Yeah, Hitler made the mistake of killing people next door. Literally, that's the only. That was kind of the.
Let's help the people out. Okay, put it this way: for your mental health, please develop a healthy paranoia of the government.
Yes.
Can I quote you on that, please?
So, lastly, with trauma, kind of the last thing I want to end on is what are some healthy individual steps that people can take? Like get 3 really powerful steps that people. I'm assuming. I think I know the first one you're going to say, which is build positive, good like face-to-face relationships.
That would be the foundational, essential piece in my understanding. That's why I asked, as I said earlier, when I have a PTSD vet or soldier, I asked them, could you bring in your spouse? And the ones who can, and the spouse will join forces, they come out of the trauma healing-wise a lot quicker than those who don't. And I end up having to be the partner. And so I have to do what's called sustained empathetic inquiry. The way I do that, I don't say to the vet, your trauma is a sign of something dysfunctional or negative. It's sadly a sign of something right about you. Let's find out what you're doing. So if traumatized people, if you recognize you have some trauma, go for walks. Ask.
And there is where it cuts out. Dr. Manock went on to talk about how discussing the trauma with people that you're close to and praying are all helpful things in dealing with trauma once you've recognized it. At any rate, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for watching this far or listening this far. And I implore you to tune in next week to discuss whatever topic we have set up for that. Thank you again, and we will talk to you later.